Special Economic Zone continues to drive debate about what a country ought to trade to secure the promise of investment. So in our second segment, we'll be asking what is too much when giving power and concessions to investors. And in our third segment, a controversy erupts on both sides of the Atlantic each year around what's known as Columbus Day, as the legacy of Christopher Columbus is further revised to acknowledge the decline that is coming initiated for indigenous peoples and what it signifies for other peoples such as Africans who would also suffer in the ensuing centuries of colonial development. We'll be asking how should Columbus be regarded in history, whether Caribbean history, American history, or European history, and why do all peoples often struggle to reconcile the truth about their most exalted icons? These are the big issues. It's Sunday, the 17th of October, 2021. I'm your host, Kieran Murdoch. Good afternoon. Welcome to our first segment of this afternoon's program. It's Sunday, the 17th of October, 2021. It's now 1:04 in the studio. We did have a bit of a late start this afternoon, folks, so I do apologize for that. In this discussion, we will be talking about the Pandora Papers. The Pandora Papers is a leak of almost 12 million documents that reveals hidden wealth, tax avoidance, and in some cases money laundering by some of the world's wealthy and powerful. More than 600 journalists in 117 countries around the world collaborated in going through the trove of leaked documents. The documents came from 14 different sources. It took months for journalists to compile reports from amidst the leaked data and information. The data was obtained by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists based in Washington, D.C., and it has been working with more than 140 media organizations around the globe. The BBC reports that the leak has revealed things such as the Qatari ruling family having avoided £18.5 million in tax on a London supermansion, the King of Jordan's £17 million spending spree on properties in the UK and the US through secretly owned companies, the Azerbaijani leading family's hidden involvement in property deals in the UK worth more than £400 million, the Czech Prime Minister's failure to declare an offshore investment company used to purchase 2 French villas for £12 million, and how the family of the Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta secretly owned a network of offshore companies for decades. The El País newspaper, based in Spain and reporting on events across the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking world, reported that according to the leaked documents across Latin America, 3 current and 11 retired presidents, 90 politicians and the upper echelons of power, entire religious congregations, world-famous artists, billionaires, and even the governor of a central bank in Latin America, and a constellation of other influential figures, have made use of tax havens for many, many, many years. And this, of course, they say is despite the region being dogged by more inequality than many other places in the world. The Washington Post reports that lawmakers in Chile are attempting to impeach that country's president over revelations from the Pandora Papers. In Nigeria, a number of current and former public officials were revealed to have or have had interest in offshore entities, despite a law forbidding public officials there from doing so. In general, the files expose how some of the most powerful people in the world, including more than 330 politicians from 90 countries, use secret offshore companies to hide their wealth. Money is often siphoned off and hidden away discreetly, and the jurisdictions with the laws favorable to allowing this type of activity are often called tax havens or secrecy jurisdictions. There's no definitive list of tax havens, but the most well-known destinations include British overseas territories such as the Cayman Islands and the BVI, as well as countries such as Switzerland and Singapore. Now, around the world, of course, there have been over the decades repeated calls for politicians to make it harder to avoid tax and hide assets, but the people who stand to benefit from such activity are part of the political elite themselves. So on this segment, we'll be asking what have the Pandora Papers revealed and what should be our response here in the Caribbean. We're happy to be joined on this panel by Mr. Akash Maharaj. He is the Ambassador at Large for the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. The body is an international alliance of elected parliamentarians aiming to combat corruption, strengthen good governance, and uphold the rule of law. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Maharaj. How are you doing?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to join you.
We are also joined on this panel by Mr. Matthew Aubrey. He is Executive Director of the Organization for Responsible Governance in the Bahamas. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Aubrey. Happy to have you back with us.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great topic.
And finally, we're joined by Professor Anthony Clayton. Professor Anthony Clayton is Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies. He has been working on national and citizen security issues in the Caribbean for many, many years. Good afternoon to you, Professor Anthony Clayton. How are you doing?
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm fine, and thank you very much for inviting me. Very important topic.
Mr. Maharaja, let me just get your first reaction to this, just to ask you why this leak is being considered so significant. We've heard of, for instance, the Panama Papers before this, and at different points there are different significant leaks of documents coming from different sources and being worked on in collaboration with many journalists and reporters around the world. But why is this one being hailed as so significant?
You are correct. This is only the most recent in mass revelations of the involvement of the wealthy and the powerful in tax evasion, money laundering, and perhaps legal, though ethically questionable practices of avoiding taxation. The Pandora Papers follow the Paradise Papers in 2017, which followed the Panama Papers in 2016, and the offshore leaks in 2013. The Pandora Papers are significant in part because they reconfirm what those previous leaks demonstrated, but also because of the scale of the Pandora Papers. They are far and away the largest leak of such documents, almost 3 terabytes of data and about roughly 12 million files. Also because of the breadth of people they implicate. As you mentioned in the opening statement, it has implicated hundreds of politicians from a majority of the world's countries, about 35 current or former government leaders, prime ministers or presidents. It's implicated kings, and it has implicated both countries in the developed and developing world. Based on even a casual analysis of these papers, there are 2 things that I think people need to take away. First of all, the vast scale of corruption and of tax evasion that happens around the world. We're going to be throwing around figures like trillions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars. To all practical purposes, the amount of money involved in this corruption is beyond human comprehension. That is to say, I don't think any person can really grasp what it means to say that $1 trillion has been stolen or has been moved secretly across borders. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is that it becomes a bit of a cliche, or has been a bit of a cliche, for people to believe that corruption is someone else's problem. This demonstrates that it is everyone's problem, that the people who are involved in corrupt activities come from the developed world and the developing world. They come from democracies and authoritarian states. They come from monarchies, dictatorships, and elected states. Really, it suggests a monumental level of corruption at the highest levels of virtually every kind of state in the world. I would say, lastly, one of the really important things to bear in mind is that this is about more than just individuals growing fat in the dark. All of this money that has been, to the extent that this money has been taken out of public taxation, this has real human impacts. So it means that there isn't money left. There isn't money for healthcare. There isn't money for defense. There isn't money for welfare. There isn't money for education. Quite literally, the Pandora Papers reveal that the political class across the world has been robbing the human race blind.
Mr. Matthew Aubrey, would you agree with that last statement there, that the Pandora Papers reveal that the political class of the world has been robbing the people blind?
Yes, I think Mr. Mirage has stated it very well there. I think the things that kind of stand out for me against this, in addition to what he pointed out, though, are the timing of it. Obviously, as we're coming through this incredible, economic impact post-COVID, to think about the implications of the monies that have been kept out of jurisdictions, and tax monies that haven't distributed, it really, as he said, brings it to a human level. But I also think it's a checkpoint for us to realize just how pervasive this is, given that this is the fourth uh, disclosure of this type. So with the vast amount of information that's been brought forward prior to this, that this continues at this level really speaks to the scope of the issue. I love the reinforcement that this is a target around corruption is everyone's problem. Our organization works on anti-corruption measures here in the Bahamas, and on a regular basis, we continue to struggle with trying to get the culture behind an anti-corruption effort or moving towards integrity. And this clearly indicates that there are things that people are not cognizant of that have huge implications in there, particularly in developing countries. So I think that's that's a standout for me.
And Professor Anthony Clayton, what is your initial takeaway from simply the scale of this leak and the amount that it reveals about the network of offshore entities and practices and affiliates and so on that have allowed so many people around the world to hide wealth, sometimes legitimate wealth, sometimes very illegitimate wealth?
Right. For me, there's 4 or 5 standout points. The first is, as I think Mr. Aubrey just pointed out, this is the 4th disclosure of this type, but there's roughly 3 times more data has been released in the Pandora Papers than in Panama. So we are starting to get a better and better picture of the size and scope of the problem. Second is, of course, we don't actually really know how big the problem is, because you're never quite sure how much still remains to be discovered. But it does mean that we can start to get a slightly better sense of the scale of the problem. Because before this, estimates of the amount of money that had been hidden offshore ranged from about 5.5 trillion up to about 11.5 trillion. And the top end of the range was about 32 trillion. At a minimum now, I think we're fairly confident in saying that it's probably at least over 11.5 trillion. Now, just to put this in context, but it is very hard to imagine sums of that scale. If you make a rather simple comparison of the country's GDP, then that would mean that the amount of money hidden offshore would be equivalent to the 3rd largest national economy in the world. And if it's at the top end of the scale, if it's 32, it would be bigger than the United States economy. There's a famous line in one of the Godfather films when one of the criminals says, Michael, we're bigger than US Steel, meaning that the mafia actually was a larger financial entity than the biggest company in the United States at the time. Well, we've gone a little bit past that. If the top end of the range is correct, then we're looking at a total volume of money that's been hidden offshore, which is now potentially larger than the largest economy in the world. The third really important point is that what it showed in the aftermath of the Panama Papers, that a lot of the money was moved. It was moved into other jurisdictions, including, for example, the BVI, which is one of the beneficiaries of the Bahamas. And what this again emphasizes is the flexibility and the readiness with which money can be moved between jurisdictions. And anywhere there is a weak regulatory system and attorneys and accountants who are willing to facilitate these practices, the money can be shifted very, very rapidly. And this has made it very difficult to, in some cases, trace, let alone do anything to reclaim some of this money. Although it is worth noting that in the aftermath of the Panama Papers, about $1.4 billion in back taxes were subsequently reclaimed. And the final point is that although there are genuine and legitimate reasons sometimes for using offshore vehicles, the most recent release indicates quite clearly that there is the proceeds of crime being included, which is also going through these channels. And there's 1 or 2 major criminals, including mafia bosses, who are known to have used this channel. And this, I think, removes the last remains of credibility from the claims that most of this is legitimate and the people concerned are doing due diligence. You cannot possibly be handling money for a known mafia boss and claim that you're maintaining standards. So those are just a few initial reactions to the latest disclosures.
Well, Mr. Maharaja, I'll come back to you just to ask. I mean, we are talking about, I mean, vast scales of money that I have to ask the question: what effect does that sort of hidden economy of often of tax avoidance? What effect does that have on national economies, particularly when you look at the developing world and you have leaders who may be found to be moving sums of money that they have illicitly or that they've been able to gather over time through different unethical practices in government, and they're able to move it offshore, avoid scrutiny, avoid taxation. What effect does that have on national economies?
Well, Professor Clayton has made an attempt, as I think we're all going to make an attempt, to try to wrap our hands around how much money we're talking about. If you're asking what is the impact on the developing world specifically, the best way I can try to encapsulate it is by comparison to the UN Millennium Development Goals. Those are and Sustainable Development Goals. Those are the goals that the UN has set to try to improve the human condition, and they include objectives like ending global hunger and extreme poverty, providing universal primary education to every child on the planet, promoting gender equity in schools and workforce, cutting child mortality by about 2/3, reducing maternal mortality by 3/4, halting the spread of HIV and malaria, and cutting in half the proportion of people without access to clean water and sanitation. The total cost of all those sustainable development goals combined comes up to roughly $500 billion. If Professor Clayton's estimates that he feels that 11.5 trillion is a reasonable estimate of how much money we're talking about here, this means that the amount of money that has been identified through the Pandora Papers represents enough money to achieve all those objectives 23 times over. Any one of those objectives, for example, ending famine across the world or reducing child mortality by 2/3, any one of the things that I've just mentioned could fundamentally remake the human condition. It could change it could change the nature of human civilization, and it would represent the defeat of some of the human race's most ancient enemies. And we could achieve all of them 23 times over for what has been identified in the Pandora Papers. And that's only a moderate estimate of how much money we're talking about here. These are not victimless crimes. I worry sometimes that people see the wealthy and the powerful living lives of splendor and excess, and many people think to themselves, I wish I could be living like that. But there's a human cost for that kind of corruption. And the human cost means that there are literally hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of people across the world who will die earlier, who will have to bury their children, who will not have education and will not have access to clean drinking water because of what has been revealed by the Pandora Papers. This theft of this scale goes beyond stealing. It is fundamentally a betrayal of the human condition. And it is, I will put it this way, in the entire history of the human species, no one has murdered as many people as are being killed through the corruption revealed by the Pandora Papers.
Mr. Matthew Aubrey, well, this may be a silly question, but why do people stash their wealth offshore? Because we usually hear that there are legitimate and illegitimate reasons for doing so. So, I mean, we can imagine the illegitimate reasons for doing so, but there's often the pushback that, of course, not everything you will find in these revelations is anyone doing anything that's illegal or unethical. What is the interest in putting your wealth offshore legitimately?
Well, and I think it's important also when we talk about offshore, the definition of offshore is kind of changed, and particularly this reinforced that, because some of the places that money that there are considered tax havens are places you wouldn't necessarily think as offshore, like Delaware and South Dakota, that have developed favorable tax laws and processes that make it easier to avoid and keep information away. So I mean, part of the process I think that this all reinforces is this growing inequality in wealth distribution, right? Since 2015, the 1% of the top of those who are the wealthiest have more than the rest of the entire world, and this just keeps reinforcing and reinforcing. And those that have money are in a place to be able to try and benefit from that and hold on to more of it, where tax burdens and the cost tends to fall in unfairly on the shoulders of those who are the most impoverished, or those that have the least. And so this just reinforces that. So looking at and it's also, you'll see as you look at these papers, that this is a mechanism that is not a nefarious process. It's a pretty regular process, right? This is a way for the super rich and the corporations to be able to do business, whether it be securing and purchasing property, setting stuff up for information for things you don't want people to know. I think one of the more publicized things that came out of this is that supposedly someone that the Russian president is got on the side was living in one of his properties, and this was a way for that person to be able to get property. And so doing things off the radar, moving money around, reducing your tax burden has long been a strategy for holding and maintaining and achieving wealth. And absolutely, this reinforces is a consistent practice within the super wealthy, and that just perpetuates itself. And this is also what's also kind of amazing in the middle of this. This is in the middle of a lot of the jurisdictions that are talked about have laws that are address and specifically speak to anti-corruption. They speak to policies, and some of the countries that this has happened have been quite vocal about their support of anti-corruption or open information, which I think is the other implication within this. Looking at how beneficial ownership and that information is now shared has been a challenge. And speaking from the Bahamas, where we're one of those offshore locations, we're continually under the onslaught of being on blacklists and gray lists. And in many instances, it's seen as this huge challenge for us to maintain and keep to a certain standard and take advantage of or leverage our advantage. But you can also see the wide misuse here and other places that leads to this incredible hidden economy, as I think it was referred to. And I think that basically the simple answer is it happens because it's allowed to happen, and there is not enough effort towards the importance of transparency and accountability in instances like this.
Well, Professor Anthony Clayton, how does anyone go about combating this? And the reason I ask that is because when it comes to national issues of transparency, integrity, and corruption, you can rely on, well, you can't always rely on, to be quite honest, but it tends to be the job of national lawmakers to clamp down on instances within the national sphere. But this type of activity is internationally networked, so no one government around the world can, on its own, really put a stop to it. So what would it take to reduce this sort of spiriting away of wealth and concealment, so as to avoid taxation, avoid scrutiny, and so on?
Well, I think both of the other speakers have already touched on this point about the kind of hypocrisy involved, which is clearly going to be a major challenge. There's a great deal of honesty about the extent to which we're really serious about dealing with these problems. And there are countries like, for example, the US, which has been quite aggressive in terms of trying to minimize the way in which US citizens can avoid taxes. by running them through offshore jurisdictions. But at the same time, the US also has 2 or 3 states, including Delaware and so forth, which actually function as offshore tax havens, if you see what I mean, and offer the same facilities, UK similarly, other countries as well. So there is a great deal of double standards here in terms of why, and it underlies why we don't get the kind of clear and agreed response between different countries, because they've got different interests at stake. And the second aspect of this is, of course, that many of our political leaders and people who play key roles in the economy have been implicated. Their names are in there. People who are heads of government or people acting for heads of government, operating beneficiary trusts for them and so forth. So at the heart of government, you have people who have been major beneficiaries and who therefore are probably not inclined to take the kinds of action needed to clean up this particular problem. But if I could also just jump back to one of the points that Mr. Maharaj made a few minutes ago about the number of people who suffer as a result. If I could just give one other example. The UN Environment Programme estimates that the cost of adapting to climate change impacts, that we would need to be spending about $300 billion a year between now and 2050. Well, to put that in context, that's only about 2.5% of the amount of money that we now think might be hidden. And even a 2.5% tax rate on some of that money would actually be sufficient to cover a lot of the mitigation costs for climate change. Now, at the moment, we're on track. By 2050, it's generally thought that maybe as much as 19% of the world's surface will become effectively uninhabitable, inundated, or the temperature will be simply too high for human survival, which will drive the largest pattern of mass migration in human history. By 2050, maybe 150 million people forced out of areas which are no longer habitable, and countries will close their borders. It'll drive conflict, civil war, and terrorism. This is the kind of future that we're going into. And the money that we would actually need to start to mitigate this threat could be raised with a 2.5% tax on the amount of money that's hidden offshore. So what's happening here is not only a really appalling problem, but we also have to understand the reason why it's so intractable, that we have people in our centers of decision-making power who have a personal vested interest in maintaining this status quo for their benefit and for the benefit of their families, friends, and key political allies.
And Mr. Maharaj, in follow-up to that, what then do you think ought to be the response of citizens and civil society in different countries around the world, all countries affected by networks like these that tend to conceal and store away wealth? And I would also ask whether or not in your observation these revelations do lead to some change, at least in countries where governments are more inclined to act on these things.
I mean, one of the potentially seriously depressing aspects of the most recent revelations is the fear and apprehension I think many of us feel that the public will be shocked and outraged for a couple of days and then the collective mind will wander. The most important thing that all of us can do as citizens in any country is not to let this go. It's to bear in mind that these people aren't just stealing, they're stealing from us. And that it's important that we put pressure on our own governments in our own countries to take action. It's also important, I think, to bear in mind something that these papers reveal that we should already have known, and that is that we are governed by human beings and all human beings are self-interested. The key towards getting the political class in our respective countries to pass laws that inhibit the kind of corruption that's been revealed isn't tugging on their conscience. And it certainly isn't hoping that the next crop of politicians will somehow be more moral than the last. the next crop of politicians will be just as human and just as frail as the last. It will be demonstrating to the political class that there's a benefit to them in fighting corruption. And that means, for example, by electing political actors who have a demonstrated willingness to fight corruption and to pass laws that make it difficult or impossible to engage in the sort of tax evasion that we have seen. In some ways, one could argue that, and many companies and law firms will argue this, that if the law allows citizens and companies to move their money out of a national jurisdiction and into a tax haven, then that individual and company would be foolish to do otherwise. There's that may not be the most edifying or ethical argument, but it is certainly a legally correct one. So it starts with passing laws in our national jurisdictions that make it difficult or impossible, that criminalize this sort of tax evasion. The second is that in larger countries, especially countries that have large financial centers like the United States or the United Kingdom, it's important that we put pressure on our political actors to use the legal jurisdiction that they have to try to thwart illicit financial flows. It's impossible to move $1 billion around the world without some of that money ending up in a British or an American bank. And that means that British and American police and government have the legitimate right to scrutinize those financial flows and to arrest people who pass money illicitly through their institutions if they pay attention and if they criminalize them. I think the last aspect is that we need to resist what often the often false argument that's made to us that it is in our interest to turn a blind eye towards corruption. So the massive amount, a lot of the money that has been revealed through the Pandora Papers has ended up in real estate in the City of London, in the United Kingdom.
Yes, I noticed that. I noticed everybody likes to buy flats in London. I find that. In fact, I think Sir Robin, I remember reporting on that. Sir Robin had some property in London. Anyway, I'm sorry, Mr. Maharaj.
No, a lot of it ends up there. And many political actors in Britain, including the current Prime Minister, when he was Mayor of the City of London, either explicitly or implicitly made the argument that the population should tolerate this because some of that money will remain in the country and will create jobs and will be good for the people. That is nonsense. One of the aspects of the massive amount of corruption that is tied up in London real estate now is that almost very, very few Londoners can actually afford to buy homes in London anymore because the influx of billions of dollars in dirty money has caused massive inflation in the price of real estate. Corruption is bad for everyone other than the people who are corrupt. And as citizens in democracies and in non-democracies, we have to remember that these people are stealing from us. It is in our interest to stop them, and it is our responsibility to stop them. I guess the last thing I would say is that we do also have to bear in mind that although the scale is vast, there are a relatively small number of actors who are involved in facilitating and making these sorts of crimes possible. About 2/3 of the companies that have been implicated thus far in the Pandora Papers were set up in the British Virgin Islands. So in other words, if the government of the British Virgin Islands, which is an overseas British territory, so they are semi-autonomous, but are also under the jurisdiction of the British government, if they were to end or even weaken the laws that allowed for anonymous companies to set up in that jurisdiction, that could eliminate 2/3 of the corruption that we have seen in the Pandora Papers. Admittedly, some of it would go elsewhere, but a lot of it would be forced to surface. Corruption isn't just the business of the developing world. It hurts people in the developing world more than it hurts people anywhere else. But this kind of corruption would be impossible without the complicity of governments, financial institutions, and legal institutions in the developed world.
And Mr. Matthew Aubrey, I'm curious for your take on this question. These often small countries, often small island developing countries, many of them
Right.
former British colonies sometimes, or other colonies, that tend to have the law firms, registries, and banks that are very, very happy to help shelter, conceal, and divert wealth from around the globe. And in those countries, it tends to be a very large part of their economy. So, you know, maybe there's a certain commission or a certain fee or very minimal tax that is paid when you register a company or when you incorporate an account, and so it becomes a large a revenue stream for a small developing government, and they tend to have no real desire to put a stop to it. And then, of course, you go to the more developed world where you have politicians acting in, let's say, the United Kingdom, United States, who again are not inclined to put a stop to it because in different ways they too are able to benefit from it.
Well, it highlights the true importance of an active and vibrant civil society. And I think that, you know, I kind of call that the particularly related to the SDGs and some of these international obligations, is there's a pretty universal call for the value of having civil society involved and citizen involvement, and focusing on accountability from that perspective. But there's really not a lot of resources designated for it. And what happens is you see that the political will in many instances, whether it be in the large countries as we talked about or the developing countries you mentioned, is not there. And particularly here in the Caribbean, we've had, you know, colonialism was not a good thing, and the follow-up was pretty substandard governance systems and a reliance on limited resources, and then even when there are places that have natural resources like some like Trinidad and some of the other spaces, the management of that historically has not been great, and it leads to an environment that lends itself to corruption, that lends itself to short-term solutions that favor a small amount of actors. And when we talk about things in the Bahamas, I think that, you know, or other Caribbean countries, I think this does pose a challenge because it's a very complex problem. So if we look at tourism as our first industry, financial services is our second industry. And when you think about the consequences of less business coming here, that could be devastating. That could be devastating to our economy. There isn't something that's naturally going to replace it. So the likelihood of a political regime to eliminate it, maybe to weaken it from external pressure, but to eliminate it is pretty minimal. So it then falls to civil society and it falls to citizens. I think what both of my colleagues today have done a great job on is bringing this down to human levels. What's the direct impact on a person? What does this mean, and what would this mean in the restoration of supports and services and resources that the citizen can see and benefit for? Or on the converse, what does it mean that they're losing each year? What does that translate to? We have, you know, major non-communicable disease issues. We have major issues in education. We have major issues in environment that limit our capacity to move forward on things like the Sustainable Development Goals or some of our other international obligations. If there was a way for us to reverse this and identify these sources and somehow benefit, there might be a greater link to that. Sanctions work to some degree, but I think there needs to be a strong relationship with the larger economies, particularly those that, as Rivera said, or the UK or the US, that are driving this, to incentivize it for jurisdictions like the Bahamas and other Caribbean countries to be able to go forward on this. There has to be some look at how we replace an industry, how an economy is bolstered up, because when we're all in crisis, and we're all in crisis now post-COVID, the likelihood of this being easy without it having even further implication on those that are most vulnerable is again, as I said, pretty minimal. So I think it's complex, but it's best managed if it's driven from an outside of government model.
And Professor Anthony Clayton, I wonder if you think there's any worth in pursuing some sort of culture change within respective business communities in different countries, where persons actually actively want to contribute their fair share of taxes as opposed to avoiding it. I think there's clearly a general culture in business communities around the world where the more you can avoid, the better, as opposed to being happy to see the effect of your contribution working in society and making things better around you. Is that a pipe dream, do you think, that we could actually, more of us, think like that?
In the end, citizen activism and changes in behavior are extremely important, but I think where they really have a role to play is in starting the process of political change. In the end, you have to turn these ideas into actual legislation and actual regulation. All businesses try, or most of them try, to be tax efficient. Now, there's an important distinction, which is extremely important in law, between tax efficiency, which is perfectly legal, and tax evasion, which is not. And this is actually can get very technical. So you can't rely on people's goodwill or on the push from citizens. You actually have to devise codes. You have to incorporate these into legislation and regulation to ensure that people remain on the straight and narrow. If every human being was an angel, we wouldn't need this, but they're not, so we do. And I think that Mr. Maharaj made a crucially important point, which we need to emphasize. That if you look, for example, at really important contributions like the US strategy to combat transnational organized crime, which came out in 2011, one of the vital things it says was you have to target, the key focus is to target not the criminals, is to target the facilitators. And these are the accountants, the realtors, the banks, the attorneys, who are moving the money for the criminals and the corrupt leaders. There are not many people with the relevant skills and contacts in the right place. It's a relatively small group globally. If you focus on that group and find ways to discourage them severely or put them out of action, you will do more to disrupt this business than you any other way. And one possible precedent or a possible model is Italy's 1982 Ronione nella Torre law, which is Article 416 bis of the Italian Penal Code. And it was anti-mafia legislation, and it introduced two key innovations. One is the crime that made mafia conspiracy a crime. So conspiring with people who are the primary criminals itself becomes a criminal act. And second, it gave the courts the power to seize the personal assets of people who are involved in the crime of mafia conspiracy, including relatives, partners, or cohabitants who in the prior 5 years had colluded, fronted for, or helped to cover up mafia operations. So this removes the immunity from the people who facilitate organized crime. Now, where again, this will get a little bit technical, is that we have this argument going on in Jamaica right now. Lawyer attorneys, some of whom we believe are involved in money laundering, are arguing that they should not be required to do due diligence on their clients. They think this would be inappropriate and unduly onerous. To which, of course, the answer is, well, attorneys in other jurisdictions are already doing this. In the UK, the attorney has to report if they have any grounds for suspicion about the source of funds. And in the USA, you are not allowed to pay your attorney with the proceeds of crime. In some jurisdictions in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, we don't have those rules. So attorneys can be paid with the proceeds of crime, and they can assist in laundering the funds from organized crime by acting as, with power of attorney. They can move the money for, even though it may in fact be derived from criminal or corrupt activities. So I think that a crucial part of the way forward is to tackle those loopholes in our legal system with the main focus being on ensuring that the people who facilitate these actions, this relatively small group, can no longer do so, at least not without fear of legal penalty.
Okay, last round of questions. Mr. Maharaja, in the Caribbean, particularly as the Caribbean is, well, for three reasons. We're developing countries, so within the group of developing countries, the practice of money being spirited away and being hidden is particularly detrimental for us. We are also a region with many of the jurisdictions that tend to be labeled as tax havens. And we're also regions with notoriously weak political institutions. So coming out of the Pandora Papers, what's your advice for the Caribbean, Mr. Maharaj, as briefly as you might be able to?
Well, I will narrow it down to make it briefer, and that would be what my advice to the people of Antigua and Barbuda. First of all, I think that countries around the world, but especially in the Caribbean, for the reasons you've listed, have to be aware that what's listed in the Pandora Papers touches them directly. There's one specific, I'll take one individual who is named in the papers, Alexandre Caz. He's a Canadian organized crime figure. He's now dead. He ran a dark web service that sold drugs, guns, child pornography. It was involved in international narcotic distributions. He was arrested in Thailand and died, apparently committed suicide while he was in custody. He was named in the Pandora Papers because he used the sorts of measures that we have talked about to not only to evade taxation but also to hide the proceeds of his wealth. He also used those measures to purchase property in Antigua and Barbuda, and also to purchase citizenship in Antigua and Barbuda through the Citizenship by Investment program that the country runs. Just like lawyers and accountants should be doing due diligence, the government of Antigua and Barbuda and the people of Antigua and Barbuda should be doing due diligence about the kinds of people they offer citizenship by investment to. I would say that the entire program of citizenship by investment is misconceived, because by allowing people to buy citizenship in your country, you are necessarily attracting people who have money that they wish to hide and have reasons to want to evade other jurisdictions. Moreover, I would say that to a much smaller extent than the City of London, the country of Antigua and Barbuda has been implicated in the Pandora Papers, in that people like Mr. Caz have been using these illicit measures to buy up property in the country, either typically not under their own names, typically through local actors or through shell companies. That too is something that the people of Antigua and Barbuda should be alert to. Antigua is a very, very rich country. The people are poor. And the reason the people are poor is that the wealth of that country, which is enormous, is being hoarded by a small group of a relatively small group of people, many of whom are part of the kinds of corrupt networks that Mr. Cazes was a part of. So I guess my one bit of advice to people in the Caribbean is that anyone who's telling you, be they political actors, be they economic actors, anyone who's telling you that it is in your interest to turn a blind eye to the kind of corruption that is passing through your island, that person is lying to you. And he's lying to you so that he can pick your pocket just as much as he is stealing from other countries.
Mr. Matthew Aubrey, your advice for countries in the Caribbean?
I think Mr. Maharaja said a lot that I would agree with. I think that we have to bring it down to implication, and I think what we've lived with and seen in many instances here are the challenges of not only corruption being embedded, but this kind of behavior being embedded. You know, Bahamas was that space that in the 80s when drugs were being moved, you know, we had whole islands designated to the process that were kept off and illegal. We're an archipelago, so in many ways there's no easy way to centralize a lot of what we do, and things can happen in their own space. So one of the things we've been trying to work on has been the concept and building a culture that looks more towards integrity. the COVID environment, to my estimation, actually changes and brings some opportunity for movement in this space. I think given that we are so crucially required by virtue of the fact that our monies are pegged to the dollar, to be dependent upon responsible foreign direct investment and our reputation, particularly as it relates to lenders. So building on the fact that we need to promote ourselves as a competitive environment and a competitive opportunity in the space of financial services, I think is where the opportunity, where we can start to bring some leverage. So working with the private sector firms, working with government to position ourselves around integrity and openness, adopting open company registers and legislation that reinforces that beneficial ownership needs to be transparent. I think these are things that now have never been more palatable here because of the current circumstance, because things have become desperate even for those that have lots of money. So I think that's the area we have to look at, is how do we continue to try and drive this as a major industry in our countries, but do so by adopting the sterling reputation, because there still will always be some level of advantage, at least in the coming years. How do we push ourselves to make sure that this is the place you want to be because we are more trustworthy, not because we are the ones where you can get away with the most? Because I think leaks like the Pandora Papers recognize and continue to reinforce that that's not going to be palatable for much longer, and that there is little opportunity to not be seen in a public light now. So hopefully that becomes a leverage point we can utilize.
And Professor Anthony Clayton, your final word in terms of what advice you would have for Caribbean countries. Sorry.
Well, I think my two colleagues have done a superb summary. I would just like to add one final minor point about this idea that we should be grateful for the trickle down from dark money going through our economies. I think that that is a singularly badly intentioned piece of propaganda, and it really isn't true. I think if you look at what's happened in Italy after they introduced anti-mafia legislation, they were able to seize billions of dollars from the mafia, and this had two major effects. First is it started to actually break the power of the mafia, and it's the first time they've ever been able to have an effective program against the mafia. And second, and this I think was the brilliant part, this is the part which wins the hearts and minds of the people, is that the assets seized, which included real estate, businesses, high-end vehicles, and private jets, many other different kinds of assets, they did not disappear into the general exchequer. They were ring-fenced, and those assets were used for the benefit of the people. Farmland taken from the mafia was turned back into community ownership. Mansions from the mafia, taken from the mafia, were turned into clinics, hospitals, and schools. With that kind of program, you can demonstrate to people that these assets are not in some way benefiting you. These assets are actually being taken from the public good. And this is a very important argument that we need to win.
And with that, we're going to end this segment here. I want to say thank you to all three of our guests. We were joined by Mr. Akash Maharaj, Ambassador at Large for the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, Mr. Matthew Aubrey, Executive Director of the Organization for Responsible Governance based in the Bahamas, and of course Professor Anthony Clayton, Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies. Thanks to all three of you.
Thank you.
Welcome to our second segment of this afternoon's program. It's Sunday, the 17th of October, 2021. It's now 1:56 p.m. in the studio. I'm your host, Kieran Murdoch. In this discussion, we are again focused on the value of special economic zones to our economic growth and development, and this is in light of the government's approval of a new license for a new special economic zone, or SEZ, that's of course SEZ, known as the Western Imperial Special Economic Zone. It grants zone status over several hundred acres of private land. The license was granted to a company called Millennia Mountain Development Antigua Limited. In the license order, the developer is granted sweeping concessions and powers over the zone, similar as was the case with the IDA International Development. Those powers include the seeming waiver of all taxes, the ability to manage and operate a customs gateway, the responsibility for development control and environmental monitoring. The developer is also licensed to market the Citizenship by Investment program, as in to seek investors to whom Antigua and Barbuda will consider selling citizenship. The order was gazetted on September 20th, 2021. The developers are related to the new Western Imperial Medical School, which opened in the special economic zone operated by Chinese investor Yi Zhang in the northeast of Antigua. So on this segment, we'll be asking what is too much when giving power and concessions in exchange for development and investment. Joining our panel for this discussion, we have two gentlemen this afternoon. Mr. Louis Rivera joins us. He is the Democratic National Alliance's Vice-Chairperson. He studied international economics and international law at the University of the West Indies. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Rivera. How are you doing? I haven't heard you as yet, Mr. Rivera. I don't know why, but your audio did not come across.
I was saying I'm well. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me now?
Yes, lovely. We can hear you now. And we're happy to have you. Thanks for joining us. We're also joined by Dr. David Hines. He's a political commentator from Guyana. He's an associate professor of African and African American studies at the Arizona State University. His focus is on Caribbean and African diaspora studies, and his research interests include governance and politics in the Caribbean and black political leadership. Good afternoon to you, Dr. David Hines. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks. Good afternoon to you and to your listening audience.
Mr. Rivera, what do you think of the new Western Imperial License Order? Do you think it gives away too much? I just want your initial thoughts. There's been a lot of discussion about it since the document itself started circulating.
Thank you very much for that question. What do I think about the order? I think that firstly, it was done without consultation, which is always my pet peeve. It's too expansive. I think it gives away too much because it comes with no guarantees. I think we need to weigh the pros versus the cons, and the way you guarantee the pros is with some sort of guarantee.
And Dr. David Hines, having had a peek at what the order entails, just curious for your initial impressions of it as an instrument trying to secure foreign investment to Antigua and Barbuda.
I echo the views of Mr. Rivera, and would like to say it's more of the same. This is not a new initiative in the English-speaking Caribbean. Between 1985 and 1995, a similar zone was operated in Jamaica. It was called the Free Zone. And the experience in that free zone was that the people of Jamaica, the workers of Jamaica, some 12,000 of them who were employed in that free zone, the benefits that came to them was not worth it. So that while the government might have been able to say that, look, we brought this initiative to help with unemployment, especially with unskilled labor, the benefits did not come to Jamaican Prime Minister Manley. Former Prime Minister Manley was very scathing in his critique of the notion, the whole idea of the free zone, operating in a sovereign country in which it, for all intents and purposes, these zones are not, they do not come under the purview of the law of the country. It's like operating a country within a country. So that general framework of this free zone, I think is not good for the countries in the Caribbean. And in this particular instance, having taken a look at the agreement, I would say, starting off with, that the people of Antigua should be extremely skeptical of this initiative.
Mr. Rivera, you've mentioned the issue of consultation, and I am getting a bit of echo there. I might have to mute someone to try and avoid that just briefly there. Mr. Rivera, you've mentioned the issue of consultation. I'm curious as to what extent you think, or when you think, that consultation in terms of government policy making is warranted. Because, of course, there are many who will argue that it's not warranted that the government consult widely on every single policy issue. That would not be efficient at all. But, of course, there are various many policy issues and decisions which consultation with different sectors, different organizations might be appropriate, and having a general informed public discussion involving as well publicizing information for the media to disseminate would also be appropriate. But I assume you think that this was one of those instances.
Yes, it's definitely one of those instances. Personally, I've always believed that anything that entails mass concessions outside of what is done through the investment authority needs public consultations, especially when we're speaking about changing or creating a space where the business and trade laws are different from the rest of the country. I am not averse to special economic zones. Some have been successful, some have failed. Some types of special economic zones are better than others. For instance, a free trade zone is a type of SEZ that's focused on it's a place where goods are landed, handled, manufactured, and then re-exported without the intervention of customs. It's literally supposed to be a place where you take the unskilled labor from the domestic population, the domestic tariff area, and are able to employ that labor in a way that is profitable for whichever private entity wants to operate within that free trade zone. However, an SEZ collectively is something much more than just a free trade zone, which means that you need to have consultation so that people know what they're getting, what they're giving up, and if any ideas or tweaks can be made going forward.
And I would also ask you, Mr. Rivera, whether or not you think that, because the concessions that are laid out in the license order, assumably having effect, the regulations and the Principal Act clearly allow for the minister working in conjunction with cabinet to do that. Do you think there ought to be some review of how these mechanisms function? Perhaps the idea that on each occasion something like this should come before Parliament.
In a perfect world, yes. But if we as a people decide that this is the type of economic development that we want moving forward, special economic zones, then maybe we as a people can decide what limits we set on any future SEZs, et cetera, instead of having to, burden Parliament every single time a new SEZ comes about. What happened is that because our initial SEZ with YEDA was designed to be so expansive, our laws that were implemented to facilitate the SEZ were also made to allow for expansive SEZs. So I really think we can just tweak the main law.
Dr. David Hines, I'm curious for your view of the language of the document. I've heard some feedback that would suggest that the language is so very concessionary in terms of assuring that the government will fast track things, will get things approved in a few days, will make all efforts to sort of assist the developer to get over regulatory hurdles. Is that the sort of language that you think is appropriate when you're dealing with an investor coming to your country?
No, it is not the type of language that should be accepted, but it is a type of language that is accepted by small economies like Barbuda and the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean. In a sense, you are bargaining from a position of weakness, because you have already signaled to these companies that you need them. And so therefore, they are going to strike a hard bargain. And when you do not have the leverage, then you have to accept that kind of language. And that kind of language is so general and overarching that once these zones begin to operate, the host countries under the gun because they will threaten to leave if they find better conditions and concessions at other places. And so, therefore, the language then becomes part of the modus operandi. And as the zone develops, you will find that the host country will be giving up more and more to keep these companies on their shores. And as I said, the Jamaica experience is very instructive. I would say if I were Antigua and Barbuda or any other countries considering these SECs, I would study the Jamaican experience at the level of the protection of the labor rights of the workers. The very sovereignty of the country is at stake. And that is why I think Mr. Rivera's point about consultation is in order. Because really risking your countries or putting your country's sovereignty on the line, you are putting the labor of your citizens on the line, because we have seen in the studies that have been done on these SECs that the rape, and I'm using that word deliberately, the rape of the labor of the people of those countries leave a lot to be desired. So as I would say, in these cases of foreign capital coming into our countries, even though we may not have the leverage, we should try as much as possible to avoid the kind of expansive language here that I see in this agreement.
Mr. Louis Rivera, I mean, if I just pull up the document and look at, any of the things which seem to be controversial under a section that discusses construction licenses and approvals, and I did note many similar things in the EIDA license order, and that was also controversial. Of course, the developer is required to set up a zone management committee, and I do think that committee is to have some representation from the government. But the developer sets up a zone management committee, which is given sweeping powers in terms of authority within the zone. For instance, I'm looking at a section here that says that the zone management committee authority shall provide or shall approve rather all areas related to architecture, structure, anti-hurricane, environmental assessment, and others, and shall be responsible for issuing permits upon fully satisfying all requirements for approvals. All permits issued within the zone shall carry the same legal validity and rights as those issued by the Development Control Authority of the Government of Antigua and Barbuda. Language like that is what I'm referring to when it sort of transfers so much responsibility over to an entity which the developer themselves sets up, even though my understanding is that entity would have some level of government representation on it. But essentially, it still is the developer's entity. And, seek your own investors and determine your criteria for what investors you want. That is the sort of language that we see in this license order. So, Mr. Rivera, your reaction to that sort of transfer of what is normally government power?
I would say that they're given way too much latitude. There's other language in there that's saying that any future concessions we give to any other investors, the zone automatically gets. It reserves the intellectual property within the zone and not in Antigua and Barbuda. We're supposed to give up, in a single instance, private customs. I would say that the verbiage is designed this way on purpose, as Dr. Hines outlined, because oftentimes when our leaders sit at the table, they think that they are negotiating from a point of weakness. I don't necessarily subscribe to that thought process, but it oftentimes is the case. And as I said, the wording of these things. So let's say all of that existed there. We provide the infrastructure, we allow for the fast tracking of licenses, we give them DCA and Environmental Department Authority. That should come along with some benefits, for instance, employment guarantees or guarantees around how much foreign currency reserves you keep within the country. the limits as to which what companies within the zone can compete with companies within the domestic tariff area, and how imports and exports within the zone and the domestic tariff area go together. So what I'm saying is that this wording isn't just to be thrown out of the window, but it should always come along with guaranteed benefits. And the less benefits that exist, which means that the wording has to be more strict. For instance, what really bothered me, I guess it's a pet peeve. The financial center is not going to be regulated by the government of Antigua and Barbuda. No restrictions on investments and risks, with absolute confidentiality. I mean, that in and of itself opens us up to gray and black lists that we've been working so hard to get ourselves off of. And it doesn't come with any guaranteed benefits. So what is the trade-off here?
Yes, I did note that there's the establishment of a sort of subcommittee of the zone management committee to operate as a regulatory, or like a little in-house regulatory body for financial services.
To handle AML, yes.
The whole language just seems so bizarre. Dr. Hines, so coming back to this issue of the language of the document and the point that Mr. Rivera raised of guarantees, when we see a very, very strong concessions like this, Mr. Rivera said that, in his opinion, we should see guarantees. No, I haven't seen any other documents related to this agreement. I don't know if there's other documents from which we could see that the government has been guaranteed certain actions from the developer, but we don't know that at this point. But would you agree that for something like this, we would need to see some significant guarantees as to what the developer intends to put into Antigua and Barbuda, and not just the promise that it may occur?
Certainly. Certainly. I think this is a very, very important project. It's an expansive project, and it's a project that that potentially compromises the sovereignty of the country, if not the physical sovereignty, but certainly the economic sovereignty of the country. It's a project that put the workers of your country at risk, but at least one would hope to see some guarantee there of protection of the labor rights of the workers. In terms of what amount of the revenues that are generated from this project stays in the country. You see, the zone, for those external actors, for them, the important thing is that they're providing employment. And so therefore the government has to guarantee what level of employment, what are the wages that are going to be paid to these workers, what comes out of the general profits stays in the country, what guarantees the country have. The SECs, they want cheap labor. What do you want as a country? And so therefore, I completely agree that there must be 2 or 3 or 4 things the country must guarantee, ask for guarantees up front, and these should be non-negotiable. This is 2021. We've been dealing with this concept of industrialization by invitation for as long as we have been self-governing country, going back to the 1940s and the 1950s. After 70 years, we should at least have a blueprint as to what is it we as countries want from these special zones. No, I don't, like Mr. Rivera, I do not oppose special economic zones in principle, but I oppose them in practice, in the sense that if the countries that are hosting these zones do not benefit from them in ways that will help the development of the country, why are we bringing investments into our countries? We're bringing them so that they can help with development. If they're not any developmental returns that are guaranteed, then I would say that it's a very, very flawed project. And the people of the country ought to ask questions that would, in some regards, slow down this project.
And Mr. Rivera,
also on the implementation of it.
Mr. Rivera, one of the things that we often note is that sometimes developers promise more than they can provide. And if one goes through this license order, it will be seen that there's a lot of reference made to potential investments in terms of education centers, in terms of the financial centers, in terms of all the various ideas for businesses and industries that could at some point potentially operate in the zone. And when you consume all of that, when you really look at all of that and you think to yourself, if all of that really did come to pass, I mean, that it would be magnificent. I mean, the zone would be a city. So you start to wonder whether or not, I mean, it would seem to be a multi-billion dollar type of investment if all of those things that are listed there were to come to pass, let's say 10 years from now. But we don't necessarily know much about this. So I suppose the question I'm asking is, should we be wary of the pie in the sky? The promise of, there's going to be at this center, at that center, so and so, X, Y, Z, so on and so forth. And really and truly, the quantum of investment that you get is much smaller.
I guess I believe in trusting but verifying. So a lot of the benefits that come from the theoretical idea of SEZs are promises in and of themselves. So you have static, or what they call direct economic benefits. That's employment, export growth, increase in government revenues. Let's say the SEZ pays a license fee, and foreign exchange earnings. And then you have the intangible benefits, they call them indirect. These are like skills upgrading, technology transfer, innovation, economic diversification, even productivity enhancement of local firms. These are some benefits that have been seen in the SEZs that have worked. And the only reason that they've seen these direct and tangible benefits is because there are guarantees for employment. There are limits around how much foreign exchange can be removed from the country. There are always payments into to the government to make sure that government revenues keep up with the size of the SEZs. So when you are making an SEZ, you have to come with these promises and things that seem so wonderful, it's almost an illusion. Because if it's successful, that's exactly what it will be. Which is why I will always harp on the fact that we need to ensure that we get guarantees so that even if it doesn't come to pass, whatever little we do get, or people aren't just left holding the bag.
And I would also ask you whether or not you think, Mr. Rivera, based on what has transpired over the years with YIDA, been a significant contributor in terms of putting money into Antigua and Barbuda, but YIDA Special Economic Zone has gone through a number of controversies to do with environmental approval and ideas for things that to operate in the zone. What should we have learned from the YIDA development, and do you think that we are in this new Special Economic Zone? Do you think we have demonstrated that we've learned anything from the YIDA development?
We haven't. The problem with the YIDA development was that it came with no guarantees. There's no minimum standard of failure. So he can destroy mangroves and push down windmills, and we don't care. He just says sorry. He can even refuse to pay local companies that have provided services. It seems as if both are connected.
Let me just jump in. Let me just jump in quickly to say I don't know that to be a fact. Just to say that.
Yes, that's what I said in my personal opinion, because I'm thinking, why would you go through the hassle and finances of setting up your own SEZ, getting it all done, and then open a med school in somebody else's SEZ? It doesn't make much sense to me, but I've never been the brightest spark in every room. However, I think that what we should have learned, and it's still not too late to learn it, that we have to make sure that we have the guarantees put in place. and maybe remove some of this expansive language around things that will hurt us in the domestic tariff area, like, for instance, lack of regulation around financial products and cryptocurrency investments, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing we want to be put is on financial grain blacklists after our reputation in the 80s and 90s.
And Dr. David Hines, on that same issue, the EDA development, of course, was quite a controversial one for the reasons that, it had to do with a lot of environmental reasons and the process of environmental approvals or lack thereof that EDA would go through over time, the hurdles, the back and forths, and so on. And of course, generally, it was a major point that it was really touted. It was touted that it was going to be such a massive investment. It has been quite significant, but it certainly was not the level that was promised. Significant nonetheless. So what should we have learned from that experience in terms of moving forward with an investor who wants to set up a special economic zone?
Well, there are two things I would say that we should have learned. One was that there needs to be more regulation on the part of the government. The government, in the agreement, needs to have much more regulation of the SEC, and secondly, the guarantees in terms of the financial guarantees that that come to the country. We should have learned to press for a more precise language. And in that regard, I think we have not learned very much. One of the things I've been looking for in this SEC is the extent to which the developer is allowed to bring in foreign labor. That has been a sore point in these SECs, that loopholes have been used to bring foreign labor in, because you're bringing these foreign labor not into Antigua, but into this zone that is not Antigua and Barbuda. And I have not seen anything in the agreement that prevents the developer from doing that. So the point I'm making here is that we should have looked at the experiences of these projects across the Caribbean, across the so-called third world, and look to see where governments have been vulnerable and try as much as possible to press to have those corrected in whatever agreement. That you can't be making the same mistakes that you made 20 years and 15 years ago. You have to study these things and to try as much as possible to see how much more you can get for the people of your country.
Well, I will just say there is a point in the license order that very briefly mentions, as you point out, Dr. Hines, it doesn't go into any details. It sets no limits, but it very briefly says that the Zone Management Committee will be able to grant permission to hire a foreign workforce. I think there might have been a few other points that spoke to it briefly in the document. Scrolling through once again now. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Rivera, whether or not you think that this particular decision to grant a new zone on these terms, which really are very similar terms to the conditions upon which the zone for EDA was granted, is perhaps caused by the government being in a bind, in that COVID-19 is a reality. The economy is suffered severely, and it is ready and willing to accept terms that perhaps it might have not accepted were the economy in a better position. I don't know. What do you think, Mr. Rivera?
I mean, if it was a different investment project, maybe. But as far as I know, the government gets $500,000 licensing and gives up tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue upfront, without any actual investment being made other than purchasing of land. And I think I remember that we're supposed to waive the stamp duties on the land too. So it seems as if it's definitely not worth it when you do a cost benefit analysis. And I guess the argument could be made employment wise that Antigua has a small population, so does the OECS. We can't find 25,000 workers in Antigua and Barbuda, so we need the ability and flexibility, dynamism to be able to bring in our own workers. Okay, fine, but what about guarantees that, say, for instance, 40% of your workforce has to be CARICOM nationals, for instance, because there's no shortage of work around the entire Caribbean, and we've put in all this work for CSME and CARICOM. We might as well get something out of it. I would say, though, that I don't think the fiscal position of our government is what has pushed them to give up so much in this particular instance. I think that regardless of our financial situation, if it was December 2019, it would have had the same wording.
Well, I don't know. I come back to the wording of this document, Mr. Rivera, and I have this suspicion, is my personal suspicion, that I'm not entirely convinced that perhaps on each occasion that there actually is a concerted effort to knit and pick at each line. I sort of get the feeling that there's a standard draft of a special economic zone license somewhere on a government computer, and every time a new investor comes for approval, they sort of just print the draft, swap out some of the names and letters, and sign it. Because, as I said, it repeats a whole lot of the stuff that was in the EDA document. I remember having to go over that thing so many times between 2016 and 2018. So do you get that sense as well? Do you get that sense at all that this was not a particularly nitty-gritty negotiation?
I definitely get that. However, I would like to point out that if you use our region's independence movement as an example, each and every country went through their own process of figuring out what constitution they wanted during independence, and all of us ended up with the same constitution. So it's not like you can't do the work and come up with the same result. So I'm not one to say they didn't do the work, but I mean, I also don't believe in coincidences, so it's hard for me to balance those two thoughts in my head.
Dr. David Hines, we're just around near the end of this segment. I want to give you the opportunity for the final word. We have just about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I will use my final word to say that, look, I don't think these things are driven by economics, and they're not driven by development, they're driven by ideology. And if you're driven by ideology, then your outcomes are going to reflect that. I think, unfortunately, in the Caribbean, in the post-Cold War era, we've become so ideologically wedded to the neoliberal approach to our economic development that we have become so uncritical. We don't ask questions. We don't look at our own peculiarities in our countries. We're not driven by changes in the world, because the United States and the big countries are never going to sign a contract like this. They are the ones who give us the blueprint, but they move on. And we hold on to these standards that are outdated, and our countries then remain in this cycle of underdevelopment because we do not engage these things in a critical way and from our own indigenous perspectives.
And with that, I think we can end this segment here. I want to say thank you to both of our guests. We were joined by Mr. Louis Rivera. He's the Vice-Chairperson of the Democratic National Alliance. He's also, he studied international economics and international law at the University of the West Indies. Dr. David Hines joined us as well. He's a political commentator from Guyana. He is an associate professor of African and African American studies at the Arizona State University. His focus is on Caribbean and African diaspora studies, and his research interests include governance and politics in the Caribbean, as well as black political leadership. Thanks to both of you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Welcome to our third segment of this afternoon's program. It's Sunday, the 17th of October, 2021. It's now 2:31 in the studio. I'm your host, Kieran Murdoch. The discussion, not the discussion, but this discussion rather, is about the perception of Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean and the wider Atlantic world, but also about the broader issue of how people and countries often struggle to reconcile the truth about their heroes or icons in history. Columbus is both celebrated and reviled in the Atlantic world. In the United States, recognition and praise of the voyages of Columbus have progressively been replaced in some areas by recognition of the harm which is coming initiated, particularly for the America's native peoples. Christopher Columbus was, of course, an Italian navigator and explorer who sailed on behalf of Spain to the Americas in 1492. He was hoping to establish an alternate route to the East and Far East, being parts of Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. But he, of course, landed in the Americas. He encountered indigenous peoples and civilizations and initiated the conquest of lands for Spain and the subjugation of indigenous peoples to mine gold and work plantations. He was not the first European to visit the New World, as the Americas became known, but his voyage did initiate an era of rapid colonization and exploration of the Americas to the detriment of the civilizations that were already there. For more than 80 years, Columbus Day has been a federal holiday in the United States, now celebrated on the second Monday in October. In many places in Latin America and in Europe, especially in Italy and Spain, parades and festivals commemorating the explorers' arrival in the Americas date back far longer. The day is becoming increasingly controversial in the Atlantic world, however, as many argue that the man himself is not worthy of commemoration. And the holiday, at least in the U.S., is seen by many people as a celebration of colonialism and offensive to America's, this is in the United States, indigenous people. Many point to his contact with native people, his governorship of territories under his control, which has been characterized as brutal. And essentially, he's seen as an icon of the initiation of the destruction of indigenous civilizations, and even for African peoples, as a symbol of the colonial experiment that would soon involve African slavery. This month in the United States, President Joe Biden issued the first ever presidential proclamation of Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States, lending the most significant boost yet to efforts to refocus the federal holiday, which is Columbus Day, toward an appreciation of native peoples. It's now to be observed alongside Columbus Day each year, which is still in existence in the United States. In his proclamation, the president said, "We must never forget the centuries-long campaign of violence, displacement, assimilation, and terror wrought upon native communities and tribal nations throughout our country. Today we acknowledge the significant sacrifices made by native peoples to this country and recognize their many ongoing contributions." In Spain, however, this month, the Spanish right-wing politicians rebuffed calls for Spain to apologize for the dark chapters in its colonial past and scorned the U.S. president's acknowledgement of the atrocities suffered by indigenous peoples in that country. On this segment, we'll be asking how should Columbus be regarded in history, whether Caribbean history, American history, or European history, and why do all peoples often struggle to reconcile the truth about their most exalted icons? We are joined for this discussion by Mr. Dobrin Omad. Mr. Omad is a director and producer of theater and music. He is a playwright, a columnist, and a calypso writer, judge, and analyst. Among his principal interests are Caribbean history and black political thought. He is a Pan-Africanist, and he is the chairman of Antigua and Barbuda's Reparations Support Commission. We're happy to have him with us this afternoon. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Omad. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Kieran. Good afternoon to your listeners.
Mr. Omad, I'm just curious as to whether or not you have, because I personally, I take note of it every year around this time when Columbus Day is celebrated in North America, that there is that ongoing debate about how he is perceived. There's a totally different perception of him, of course, in the Caribbean. But I'm wondering whether or not it's ever something that's caught your attention before, that debate that tends to take place around this time each year in different parts of the Western world.
Oh, yes. Oh, certainly. It's a very significant observation, particularly in the reparations movement, where the call for that day to be known as a Holocaust, the day of the Holocaust for indigenous people. Also calls for it as an Indigenous Peoples Day across the region. It is within the movement. There's a total rejection of course, of the concept of Columbus Day to be celebrated here in the Caribbean. So the answer is yes. It is something that we have focused on, that we continue to focus on, that we see it essentially as a major example of how history is taught in this region. A history essentially written by victors, a history written by colonialists, a history written by explorers and exploiters that we as victims continue to learn. So yes, certainly it is on the table as far as our discussions are concerned.
And I'm curious as to what you think the differences are as to how we perceive Columbus in the Caribbean. Of course, the Caribbean is a diverse space, but how do you think he is perceived here? I mean, in your own thought, how do you think that most people view Christopher Columbus throughout the Caribbean?
Well, most people will view him on the basis of what they have been taught. Most people will view him on the basis of what their history teachers and their Sunday school teachers and their parents tell them about Columbus. And unfortunately, the work has not been done to reveal the true character of Christopher Columbus, the character of him as an exploiter, as a brutal murderer in many instances of indigenous people in this region. But the view, I mean, the perception of him, as I've just described, is not universal. The work has been done by many of our leading historians, the work of Merrick Williams, the work of Hilary Beckles, work of Vereen Shepherd. We come to bring to mind the work of Jan Carew, for example, Ivan Van Sertima, as they came before Columbus, so that the work has been done. And of course, not only at that formal level, but certainly at popular level. The work of Shadow, Calypsonian Shadow, Columbus Lie, and a number of other Calypsonians and creative artists have addressed this in the region. What we are dealing with is a failure to translate the thoughts of our own scholars, our own creatives, into our education curriculum. This is really what we're dealing with. This is the, I think, the crux of the matter. It's not that we do not know. It is not that the truth cannot be told. It is there. It is in our faces. But that failure to translate this into those channels that form the perceptions and the knowledge and certainly the attitudes of our people towards not only Christopher Columbus, because I'm sure that this discussion certainly is going to widen a bit from Christopher Columbus, to a number of similar atrocities that we continue to celebrate across this region. That is the failure, I think, that we must be dealing with in this instance.
Well, I would ask you just to follow up whether or not, because I'm interested in how different groups perceive individuals based on what connection they have, whether or not they are part of the same nation, a part of the same country, part of the same race, part of the same ethnicity. And so you have in Western countries with European peoples or majority populations descended from European peoples, certainly a more settler-oriented and positive view towards certain historical figures. Meanwhile, you have communities of native peoples, you have communities of African peoples, whose historical narrative is completely different in terms of the effect that particular historical figures would have had on them in history. Do you think it's necessary, as all groups, especially in countries where it's multiracial, it's multi-ethnic makeup, reconcile that history and come to some common truth? Or is it enough that different groups just hold their different narratives and teach their own versions of history?
I think that examination of the source of colonialization, the examination of the source of the invasion, of the brutalities, etc., essentially will lead groups within this Caribbean to a common understanding. In the reparations movement, we like to see the history of the Caribbean as three acts of the same play. And the same play is exploitation and colonialism. What are the three acts, of course? First of all, the genocide of indigenous people, led by Christopher Columbus and those of his ilk that continued for about a century. And then we had the enslavement of African people, the kidnap and the transportation of Africans from the continent into this Caribbean to work on colonial plantations. And the third act, of course, is the deceptive indenture of Asians who were brought also to the Caribbean, mainly after the emancipation of the 1830s, 1834, 1838, to provide a labor replacement of Africans who essentially viewed their freedom as giving them license to be away from that colonial exploitation. And so what I'm suggesting is that behind every major historical wrong, there is one source continuously, one source of European colonialization, European domination. I think the exploration of that and the understanding that regardless where you perform in this play, regardless where your ancestors performed in this play, whether it's Act 1 of the genocide of indigenous people, or Act 2, the enslavement of African people, or Act 3, the deceptive indenture of Asians, that the source of your problems common. And I think that it is that exploration that will allow us. Suddenly, it will not eradicate the differences in perceptions within groups. I think that you spoke of. It will not eradicate it completely, but certainly it will go a long way of helping us to understand each other within that cauldron of colonial exploitation.
You mentioned earlier, as we were going on, the fact that we do have other false narratives that we continue to hold to that ought to be revised. I just wanted you to go into that point a bit, if you could. Any other issues that you take in terms of how we teach our history, particular individuals or particular events, just to expound on what your meaning was.
Well, clearly, all across this region, we're inundated with monuments and statues and place names of exploiters up and down this region. Here in Antigua, we can name them, the colonial leaders, the colonial exploiters that we still hold in high regard as part of our history. I think we need to stop for a while and try and understand why is it, we build monuments? Why is it we build statues? Why is it we name places after particular individuals? And I think that what will become very, very clear is that it is an attempt to demonstrate to the present generations and subsequent generations that these individuals are individuals that we hold in high regard, that we hold in high esteem. We name the airport in this country after V.C. Bird. We do not name it after Bulgani or Skillful. No, we don't. And so within that understanding, of why we assign names to streets and monuments, why we assign names to statues, why we build statues, etc., to these people. It is that we are saying that our society recognizes the value and the importance of these individuals and their behaviors, their morals, etc., as examples that we should follow. Oh, having said that, I think we are also in a historical period right now where that idea is being challenged, well, not being challenged, the idea is being supported that these monuments and statues, etc., must bear names of individuals that we value in our society. And so across this region, in the last decade or so, we have seen the demonstration of that. We've seen what? We've seen, well, quite recently, the removal of Nelson's statue in Barbados.
Do you think we? I want to jump in. I just want to jump in quickly. Do you think we need to make any adjustments to how we treat with the Nelson's dockyard?
Yes, certainly. Some of it has already been done. As a historical site, it is not as a World Heritage Site, it's not the Nelson's dockyard. As a World Heritage Site, it's a naval dockyard of Antigua and Barbuda. It's not Nelson's dockyard. The whole idea of slapping Nelson's name on it is a tourism idea to attract sailors or whatever it is to the country. And so half of the work is already done. Yes, we must treat with that. Yes, and the national parks is already doing work, although I do not think with the intention of having the name removed or to treat the dockyard differently. I do not think that is necessarily the intention. But if they continue doing their work that they're doing, of the identification of March 8th, etc., as a dockyard there, and the understanding that dockyard was built by African enslaved labor, in the most parts, and some free labor, if I understand the history correctly, then we must take the next step and deal with the removal of Nelson from the name on that dockyard. As a matter of fact, the history, and again, we must understand our history. The historical documents of Nelson himself suggest that he didn't like this country. He did not like this place. He stayed on his ship instead of coming off into what I think he considered a hellhole. And so, yes, we must deal with issues of that sort.
That being said, I'm quite interested to get your take on the issue of how societies, after they build up an idea, an image of their exalted heroes and leaders, even if within that image they've whitewashed, they've cleaned out certain things, and all societies do it, some to different degrees of severity. After you've built up an image and you've run with it for so many years, as is the case with Columbus in many parts of the world, why then it becomes so difficult to reconcile when someone comes to you and says, okay, but hold on a minute, these are actually the facts. What are your thoughts on that issue? I mean, for instance, if we had historical figures here in Antigua and Barbuda dear to us from, let's say, the period of independence, union, trade union movements, if you're looking at the 30s or 40s or 50s are coming up, and at some point we are forced to reconcile any of those critical individuals, wrongs they may have committed, sins they made, that we may find it difficult. I'm just curious for your take on how peoples find it difficult to reconcile truths when it comes to their exalted heroes and so on.
Not all peoples, you know. Yes, I suspect what you're suggesting might be true in many ways of the Caribbean. When we look at, let's take, for example, Germany. After Hitler, the German government, the new government, who wiped out every single statue, every single monument that celebrated Hitler and his National Socialism, etc., wipe them out, basically. So a lot of it will come from political understanding of the historical realities. And it will also, and when I talk about the political understanding, that political understanding must also be driven by popular understanding. There's a sense that monuments and statues, etc., embody the sort of historical certainty. Yes, this is what happened. But the reality is that those certainties are not incontestable. Those certainties can be challenged, must be challenged, and we are in history now understanding how the challenge takes place and what we must do to challenge them. We are probably in the final considerations dealing with a political issue, because the power to name and rename lies with political leadership. What we are witnessing is that where political leadership has failed, that a certain amount of, they refer to it as vandalism, but a certain amount of people's action takes place to enforce the understanding of history. And we certainly do not wish it to come to that, as we have seen with people like Colson in the United Kingdom, where understanding people go and pull down these statues. We do not need it to come to that if the political leadership that has the power to do the renaming and the recasting of the history in public eyes, if they take action. And this is where the call must be at this point in time.
Well, let me ask you, do you think that, for instance, places in Antigua and Barbuda, such as, I think it was King George V grounds, Queen Elizabeth Highway, Princess Margaret School, do you think that these individuals are worthy of commemoration through, various buildings and monuments and roads and highways in Antigua and Barbuda? Do you think their names should
not in our history, not in our history. I mean, let's take, for example, the Princess Margaret School. No, that is a very, very important institution in this country. It is the colonial government's first attempt to provide secondary education to nationals in this country. Secondary education was provided to the church schools, at the grammar school and the high school, and of course the work of national hero Nellie Robinson. But the Princess Margaret School is the first attempt to do that, and we have it named after Princess Margaret. Yes, I mean, we need serious revision in all these things. The Queen Elizabeth Highway, I guess we can't touch that. The Queen is still head of state. But we do have American Road, the Botanical Gardens.
Name it Sir Rodney Highway.
Yeah, sorry?
So we could name it Sir Rodney Highway.
we have all sorts of possibilities, all sorts of heroes in this country who have struggled in education, for example, that have not been honored. I hate to do this, but I must in a discussion of this sort. When I look at people like my uncle, Christopher Manasseh Mad, moving from rural pupil teacher, self-educated, external degree from Oxford or London, up to Minister of Education in this country. I know I have resisted doing this for many, many years, but certainly not given the support, the accolades, I think, that he deserves. And he's only one. There are just so many others. And yet we have all these places, King George Memorial Grounds. Oh, come on. Victoria Park. That's the name of our botanical gardens. And we can continue on. Perhaps the worst one, and the one that I think needs to be addressed, is the whole question of calling the capital village in Barbuda after Codrington, a vicious slave owner who received thousands of pounds on emancipation for freeing 500, 600 enslaved Africans in Barbuda, and we still have the capital of that country named after him. He went, yes, I mean, I can get emotional about this issue, but we need to take account as to what the bearing, the continued bearing of these names of colonial persons, colonial exploiters, etc. What does that do on the psyche of our people and the psyche of our youth?
All right, we are coming down just to the end of this segment. It's been quite enjoyable. I would ask you for your last words as we wrap up, Mr. Ahmad. Of course, we are speaking about the issue of how we commemorate historical figures and how we reconcile the truth about those historical figures and how different peoples have different historical narratives about different figures that sometimes need to be reconciled, especially if they're living in a multi-ethnic or multiracial society, as many of us are. But your final word for this segment, Mr. Ahmad.
Yeah, basically, again, to reiterate that the historical facts, the historical truths, the historical certainties are available to us. The understanding of the intent of naming monuments and statues, we must understand that when the colonials named them, that it was certainly not about education. A lot of it was about intimidation of our people. A lot of it was about a demonstration of power, of who sits on these pedestals above us, around whom we must circulate. And again, I would like in closing to understand, to share the understanding of the importance of political leadership on these issues, and therefore for us in the public, the issue of what political leadership we support to take us forward. We take a look at the difference, for example, of political leadership in the United States, the difference between, or in the United States and Europe, the difference between a Joe Biden, for example, who in your introduction, you pointed out, is now calling October 11th Indigenous Day, and people like the one-man horror show Trump and Macron in France, who are very, very clear that these things must stay as they are. So that change will perhaps only come through the change of those who have the power to make the changes that we want.
With that, we're going to end this segment here. I want to say thank you to Mr. Dobreen Ahmad. He's a director and producer of theater and music. He's a playwright, a columnist, a calypso writer, judge, and analyst. Among his principal interests are Caribbean history and black political thought. He is a Pan-Africanist, and he is the chairman of Antigua and Barbuda's Reparations Support Commission. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Mr. Ahmad. Do have a good day.
Thanks so much for having me, Q.
On today's program, an unprecedented leak of financial and corporate information known as the Pandora Papers has revealed more about how elites around the world conceal wealth, avoid tax, launder money, and in some cases engage in corrupt acts. So in our first segment, we asked, what have the Pandora Papers revealed, and what should be our response here in the Caribbean? In our second segment, the newly gazetted Western Imperial Special Economic Zone license continues to drive debate about what a country ought to trade to secure the promise of development. So in our second segment, we asked what is too much when giving power and concessions to investors. In our third segment, a controversy erupts on both sides of the Atlantic each year around what's known as Columbus Day, as the legacy of Christopher Columbus is further revised to acknowledge the decline that his coming initiated for indigenous people and what it signifies for other peoples such as Africans who would also suffer in the ensuing centuries-long colonial experiment. So we asked, how should Columbus be regarded in history, whether Caribbean history, American history, or European history, and why do all peoples often struggle to reconcile the truth about their most exalted icons? You've been listening to The Big Issues for Sunday, the 17th of October. My name is Kieran Murdoch. I've been your host. I am the producer of The Big Issues for Observer Radio. Our studio technician this afternoon was Joseph Antonio. This program will be rebroadcast on this station at 6 p.m. You can also find the video on our Facebook page, and you can actually listen to it as a podcast. The backlog has been cleared, so you can actually listen to all the previous episodes, the latest episodes. You can find them online. Do join us again next Sunday, which will be the 24th of October, for another edition of this program. I believe Sessions in Steel with Sam Roberts is up next.
We are the voice of the people. Radio 911 FM.